Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Collective Impact Forum virtual coffee. I am Jennifer Slansky-Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Before we dive into our conversation with today's guest, I'm going to spend a few minutes orienting you to today's session. So today's conversation will run for about 60 minutes. Feel free to grab a literal cup of coffee for our virtual coffee session. And in these virtual coffees, we really try to keep it casual and give an opportunity to learn from practitioners about the great work that's happening across the country and across the globe. We'll spend roughly the first half of our time with me asking some questions to today's guest, Ellen Kahler, and then we have time at the end for you all to ask questions as well. A couple of notes. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a question box. You can use that for either technical questions, or you can use that to ask questions of our guests later in the presentation. We also have a copy of today's presentation as a handout in the handout section on the right side of your screen. So you are welcome to download that if you'd like a copy of the slides. And since the session is being recorded, you will have access to this session at a later date. In the next day or so, we will send a link to the email that you used to register for this with a link to the webinar itself. Let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, you can use the question box to ask questions, and we will be taking those questions after a few questions that I'll be asking of Ellen. If you want to share on social media, we have a few hashtags there as well. And if you need technical assistance, you can use the chat box or you can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org. All right, let's go to the next slide. So during today's virtual coffee, we have the first of a series of virtual coffees that are based on the recent research study, When Collective Impact Has an Impact. This study was commissioned by the Collective Impact Forum and conducted by Spark Policy and ORS Impact to examine the research question, to what extent and under what conditions does the collective impact approach contribute to systems and population change? If you're interested, the full report can be downloaded from the Collective Impact Forum, the Spark Policy, or the ORS Impact website. In addition, we did a webinar with the research team in May, and a copy of that webinar is available as well. Next slide. So as ORS and Spark Policy were doing the research, they worked with 25 sites across the country as participants in the research study. And today we are delighted to have Ellen Kahler from Vermont Farm to Plate with us. So this on the screen you can see is a map of all of the participating sites. Over the next few months, we will be speaking with a number of the other participants as well. And today is the first of that series. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So as you can see on the screen, I'm joined today by Ellen Kahler. Ellen is the Executive Director of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund and has been in that role since 2005. In 2009, the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund was tasked by the Vermont legislature with developing the Vermont Farm to Plate Strategic Plan, which is a statewide 10-year food system development initiative. After releasing the plan in 2011, the VSJF then created the Farm to Plate Network, which is now over 350 organizations strong. And this network was responsible for implementing the plan. The VSJF serves as the administrator and the backbone organization for the Farm to Plate Network and manages the analysis and goal tracking of the Farm to Plate Strategic Plan and implementation. So welcome and thank you for joining us today from Montpelier, Ellen.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you all.
Excellent. So as a place to start, let's just learn a little bit more about your work and the role that you play within the initiative.
Sure. Why don't you advance the slide, Robert? So as you said, Jennifer, the Vermont Farm to Plate initiative is a 10-year initiative for collectively strengthening Vermont's food system. Next slide. And the Sustainable Jobs Fund, which I work, was tasked with this effort by the Vermont State Legislature in 2009 And the reason for that was because there was a lot of activity happening in the food system that was seemingly unconnected, uncoordinated, unaligned, non-aligned. And so it felt to both funders in the philanthropic side, but also legislators, that while there was a lot of good stuff happening, they couldn't quite get their arms around, well, what exactly is happening, and is it actually being impactful, or are there duplicative things going on? So when they tasked us to develop the Farm to Plate strategic plan, they actually indicated 3 specific outcomes: to increase jobs and economic activity in Vermont's food system, and to improve access to healthy food for all Vermonters. So we set about doing that over the 18 months. And then if you go to the next slide, when we released the plan in January of 2011, it was just as the whole collective impact series was starting to come out. And so we were very excited to learn about collective impact and the research that was done, because we were already thinking along these lines. So what you can see on this slide is basically how we've implemented a collective impact approach and using the framework to guide our work. So the common agenda for us is the Farm to Plate strategic plan. And then mutually reinforcing activities is the Farm to Plate network, which is, as I mentioned, 350 organizations, but we have a series of working groups and cross-cutting teams and task forces, which we can get into in a little bit. Continuous communication, we have a pretty robust communications infrastructure that we've built across the network, and with a website and e-newsletters and listservs and such. The Jobs Fund serves as the backbone support organization. And then we adopted fairly quickly after we launched all of this, we adopted results-based accountability as our shared measurement system. And that has also proved to be very helpful to have that shared measurement system. And then if we were to add a 6th condition to collective impact, we would add funding, or multi-year funding, as an important condition to collective impact success. And I would say that the one feature that I would really hone in on, and I think we're going to spend some time talking about, is the Farm to Plate network, that we really took a network approach to the work itself, and that's been an important part of our effort.
Great, thank you for the overview. And I'm curious, so you've put the 5 and 6 conditions in place, and I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the accomplishments of the group over the last few years.
Sure, you can advance to the next slide. I mean, there's a lot, and people can visit our website. We have a Getting to 2020 section of our website that tracks, where we've built a bunch of data visualizations that track progress at the population level, indicator level, for all 25 of the goals within the strategic plan of Vermont Farm to Plate. And so just one example, probably the easiest one for people to get their heads around, it's the one that the legislature in Vermont here is most interested in, the governor and such, is and relates to one of our main outcomes around increasing jobs and economic activity, is actually our jobs numbers. And we track this annually. And since we started in 2009, over 7,700 net new jobs have been created in the food system, which is a 13.3% increase. It's been an increase at a higher rate than other major economic sectors in the state. And we're pretty proud of those results. And part of it is because of the excitement that we've been able to generate around the opportunities for developing a local food system, in addition to, I mean, we're not trying to create an island or anything, right? We're trying to increase the percentage of local food that Vermonters are eating to 10% of their total food spend. And we're tracking that as well. We are currently at about 7%. We're hoping to get to 10% by 2020. Let's see, do I have another slide? Oh, I don't think I have another slide on results. Do I?
Robert, let's go to the next slide. Yeah.
Oh, yes. So, I would say that one of our big results, honestly, has been around relationship building and the level of connectivity and alignment across the system. This has been a really big part of our network building that has happened over the bunch of years. And what has resulted in that is the ability to align activity around specific actions that are going to create the kind of population level indicator change that we're seeking through this effort. It's really the foundation of this work is really relationship building. We've also had a lot of success around working with grocery store owners to get more local food sourced into their stores. Same with institutions of higher education, with hospitals, with schools. We have a pretty robust gleaning network in the state of folks that go to farms and glean edible product after the main harvests have taken place. We've done a lot of work around humane meat raising of meat animals, and as well as their processing and maintaining and building awareness around the importance of humane meat handling and processing. We've done a lot of work to really connect dots. Oftentimes with complex systems, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of information flows are not as connected as they need to be in it. And so as the backbone and built into the very nature of the network are efforts to really help to share intelligence, what's happening in the marketplace, how are things changing, how are things adapting, what's emerging, and be able to share that very quickly through the network so that private sector businesses, nonprofits, government agencies that are all part of this effort can adapt as quickly as possible.
That's cool. So you've talked about sort of the range of stakeholders and communication across them. What does the formal governance structure and decision-making structure look like?
Yeah, sure. So the next slide. One of the things that Jennifer and Tracy were interested in was learning a little bit more about the sort of the culture of the organization too. And I thought I'd start with talking a little bit about our culture that we built, because it's infused into the actual structure of the network. So we started by developing a set of guiding values around things like equity, collaborative interdependence, shared leadership and accountability, transparency and inclusiveness, intentional and reflective analysis. So those were things that we really felt were really important for a network of organizations to be able to do together, so that when you, in essence, come into the farm to plate space, people have learned, like, this is just how we are together. These are things that we practice doing together, and they're baked into the actual structure of how we do what we do. And we can talk a lot about the shared leadership and accountability, as how that's baked in. So move on to the next slide, where I have a picture of what our network actually looks like. So the large blue circles are really the locus of action and activity in our network, in that they're what we call working groups, and we have 5 of them: consumer education and marketing, education, workforce development, production and processing, aggregation, distribution, and farmland access and stewardship. And these really came out of the planning process. As we did the planning process, which was very rigorous, 1,500 different people were engaged in some form or another in that process. These were the sort of leverage points or focal areas where there was a need, there were bottlenecks, there were obstacles, there were need to better understand how that part of the system worked. And so we formed these working groups. They meet quarterly, and they elect co-chairs to run their working groups. The chairs have a contract with us at the Jobs Fund for 1 year. They receive a stipend of $5,000 each for their work. There's a job description that's connected to their contract. They have a midterm and an end of term self-evaluation that they turn into us. So we built into the leadership of these chair roles this mutual accountability. So they get elected by the folks that are part of their working group, but then they owe sort of good leadership back to those that they're helping to guide through an annual work plan. Those working groups then form task forces based out of their conversations at a sort of a 15,000-foot elevation at the working group level. What happens, as is in collective impact, new concepts, new ideas, new needs emerge. Things you couldn't see before, you can now see, because you have people in the room together that normally aren't in the room together. And so dots start to get connected automatically and inherently. And out of that, then projects emerge. So we have an agritourism task force that's really working hard, for instance, to increase the number of farms that have experiences that are offered to both Vermonters and visitors to the state, that you can do a farm stay on their farm and learn how to milk a cow, for instance, or you can have a meal, a farm meal in the field some evening at dusk when it's really beautiful out, for instance. And then we have other task forces that work on opening up institutions to sourcing more local food by better understanding their procurement policies and really understanding sort of the rules of the game, so to speak. And so those task forces are shorter lived. They come and go, they emerge and then they dissolve based on the project and the need, but they're accountable back to their working group. They are formed out of a working group process, and then they report back to that working group, and then they ultimately dissolve when that working group wants them to dissolve. So again, mutual accountability back and forth. And then on the outermost ring, cross-cutting teams, these are groups that are a little bit more thematic. We have a health cross-cutting team, energy, financing, food access, research, and food cycles relates to food waste. And part of why those are what we call cross-cutting teams is because they basically cut across the entire food system of production, processing, distribution, and sales. And we wanted to make sure that all of the working groups were, in essence, paying attention to all of these larger cross-cutting issues and vice versa. So there is definitely some interaction between the cross-cutting teams and the working groups, but it's also the case that the cross-cutting teams keep a higher elevation view on what's happening within the food system related to financing, for instance. Are there all the needed forms of capital in order to support a growing food system, farms and food businesses, for instance? And then in the center is the steering committee, but I'm getting to that last because oftentimes the steering committee is formed first, and the steering committee is the locus of power and control and decision making. And in our case, we intentionally chose the working groups to be the center of decision making for what types of discussions, projects, activities were going to take place. The steering committee is meant to just keep an eye on how it all is working, making sure that there's cross-group interaction when needed between groups. They help us, they help the backbone organization to think about developing our annual farm to plate gathering. So what should the themes be? We have a small pot of funds for grant making for task forces, so they'll decide on applications for task force funding, for instance. But they're keeping an eye on the health of the network as a whole, right? But they're not driving the direction. The direction is being driven by the working group level, which is where people have the expertise to really do so.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's a tactical question, but how often do these different groups tend to meet? I'm curious about the level of engagement and commitment that happens at those different levels.
Sure. So the working groups meet quarterly, and the cross-cutting teams meet 2 to 3 times a year, and the task forces meet as often as they need to because they're usually working on specific projects that have a beginning, middle, and end. So they may meet monthly sometimes. The steering committee meets 5 to 6 times a year. And actually, if you go to the next slide, I can explain who's on the steering committee, because I think that's also different than a lot of what collective impact or initiatives might think to do. So our steering committee is made up of the 5 working group chairs who are elected. Remember, they were elected. And then the food access cross-cutting team, because one of our major outcomes is around food access, but also because food access cuts across the entire food system. We have a food funders network, philanthropists in the state that are very much involved in funding food system related work. So they choose a representative to represent them on the steering committee. The Farm to School Network is another network that actually predated Farm to Plate, and they're a network of all the different types of organizations and schools involved in farm to school activities. And so they have a representative seat because it's such a big and mature network in and of itself. And then we have a seat for the Agency of Agriculture and a seat for the Agency of Commerce. in part because we have this connection to the state being legislatively enabled, but also recognizing we're really sending a strong message here that agriculture and food system development is economic development. And that conversation, that narrative was not in place when we first started in 2009. There were many in the traditional economic development world that thought that agriculture was dead in the state and was a dying industry. And, but we've created 7,700 new jobs since then. And so that's not the case anymore. We've had a lot of new food manufacturing plants and expansions that have taken place. And so what's terrific about having the state agencies at the table is that we're really able to, again, connect dots between and across the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector.
Yeah, super interesting. So one of the things that we thought was particularly interesting about your work was this way of building leadership capacity and accountability across the network. So can you share a little bit more about both the why and the how you've thought about building leadership capacity? Yeah. So both, intent and some of the activities.
Sure. And I'll start with this, the actual structure of the steering committee. A lot of times what happens is that we think of how do we get all of the executive directors and agency heads to be on the governing body. And that has its place, I think, especially early on when you're trying to build buy-in and you're trying to get high-level people to open doors, to unlock money, to agree to go in a policy direction. So I think early on in the genesis of building a network, it can be extremely helpful to make sure that you have the buy-in from those at the tops of organizations. However, what we found and what we sort of planned for was that we want to continuously develop the next generation of leaders, and then a recognition that sometimes the executive directors get into too much territoriality and are too protective of their turf. And what we need in a collective impact approach is really to bust up silos and to bust up the ways traditionally things have always happened. And so what we found was by structuring, having the governance structure the way that we have with this network, it encourages the next generation, or say mid-level manager types or program directors, to step into leadership roles. And they're elected, so they're accountable back to not only their home organization, but then also to their peers. So if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more of how we think about this and plan for it. So as I mentioned, all of our working group co-chairs have a stipend of $5,000 a year. So if you're the executive director of an organization, you're likely not gonna, you have a nice salary, you're not gonna, getting $5,000 to lead some group quarterly is just not something you're gonna care too much about in most cases. But if you have a mid-level staff person who is maybe a program director and they're funded by soft dollars, it can be very helpful to provide $5,000 because we're asking them to provide significant time towards this effort. So we're in essence compensating that organization to free up a little bit of time of their staff person to provide leadership to this working group or this cross-cutting team or task force. So the cross-cutting teams, because they meet a little less regularly, receive a $2,500 stipend. Task forces in the same way. Oftentimes with the task force, they've raised additional funds for their project, and so they've built in some money to help cover some of their staff time on things anyways. So this is just a little extra. And then in order to encourage farmers and private sector folks to participate, we provide a $30 an hour stipend plus mileage to come to meetings, recognizing that, if you're a sole proprietor or a small business owner, or you're a farmer and you come to a 3 or 4 hour meeting, like, you're not earning any money. You're not covering your time. And so by just sort of no questions asked, if you want to come, you get this stipend it's not an income sensitive kind of a thing. And we found that and then we provide support for the same types of folks to come to our annual gathering. We'll sometimes comp them the total cost of the event. And what we really want to do is we want to strengthen the ability of the private sector to show up and be part of this these conversations with the nonprofit and government sector. So we intentionally find ways to make that easier to happen. And then we have a leadership retreat we do once a year in the springtime. We bring together all the chairs of all of the groups, as well as the extra steering committee members. And at that session, we really think about how is the network evolving as a whole. We build in time for cross-group connectivity. So in some cases, a couple of working groups might actually be getting to the point where they're realizing that they have some things they want to do together. So we had a joint meeting of the farmland access group and the production and processing group around the issue of farmland succession. And they got together and did a field trip together on a farm, and they had a number of speakers that talked with them about issues around farmland succession and the challenges of that, as a for instance. That grew out of a leadership retreat where the chairs of those two working groups were like, hey, we're talking about farmland succession too. Oh, maybe we should get together and have a joint meeting. So things, again, classic collective impact, things are just emerging that you take advantage of those opportunities. And then finally, one of the things that we do is we plan for early on in the network. We don't do it as much anymore, but early on it was really important to provide professional development training to the chairs and key leadership within the network. And the reason for that was because to work in a networked way is different than, say, working in a coalition or just running an organization. It requires that you give and then you also receive, obviously, lots from the process, but you have to give and you have to learn how to share credit, and you need to learn how to hold space for really challenging conversations sometimes. And so as a result, there's some additional skill building around how to facilitate in a network environment, how to facilitate network leadership, for instance, how to do project management effectively, because we don't want to waste people's time coming to a lot of meetings. So we take a very project management approach to everything that we're doing. When results-based accountability came along, we needed to do some training around, well, what is results-based accountability and how might this intersect? How do we talk about the activities of the groups in an RBA way? So we actually provided day-long training sessions where we brought in outside facilitators and experts to come and do some actual day-long workshops on these topics with key leadership and emerging leaders within the network. And that's really has served us, because it's not only has it really strengthened the capacity and the leadership skills within the network, but it's also those people that went through it have brought those skills then to their home organization. So it's really been a win-win. And we just built in the cost of running those trainings into our budget. We just planned for it. So it's very intentional. And it's something that I think has really paid dividends for us. Because when you think about it, I have a staff of 3.5 FTEs that's running the basically serving as the backbone for this huge effort. But I've got 23 chairs. So had we not figured out how to structure and provide stipends and support and leadership development for all of these chairs, I would have had to have like 15 staff. So it's much less expensive, quite frankly, to pay $5,000 for a stipend than it is to have an FTE to basically have to manage all these different groups.
Yeah, great point. Several folks are asking questions here about who provided the training and if you have any resources very specifically that you would suggest on, I think in particular, the network facilitation type training. People would welcome that.
So network facilitation, early on when we were just forming the network, we actually hired two people, Curtis Ogden from the Interaction Institute for Social Change and Beth Tenner from New Directions Collaborative. And we worked with the two of them for 2 years, and then we didn't need two trainers, so we just stuck with Curtis for a couple more years. And he, through IISC, provided and did the network facilitation, network leadership trainings that we held a couple day long over a couple of year period. And then with the results-based accountability, we have some expertise here in the state, people that have gotten trained to be trainers in RBA. So a lot of states, I think, have that now. And there's a whole national network that you can tap into. And project management, forgetting the fellow's name, he was out of Cleveland, but there's lots of people out there that have expertise in how to set up project management approaches to things. And again, it's got to be sort of baked into then how you're doing the whole setup of running your network, right? So we did project management because we were developing work plans that were built on a project management approach, and we require all the chairs for all the groups annually to have a work plan. And so there's, it's not just you just have a training, but it's actually how do you have a training to support part of the structure of what you're trying to do, and governance and capacity building and accountability and all of that you're trying to embed in your network work.
Yeah. Did you, someone's asking if you actually did any collective impact training specifically?
We didn't do any specific training, although in the early years when the first 3 articles came out, they were required reading at our gathering every year. In the fall, we have an annual gathering, and so conveniently they were usually coming out in January or February, and so by the next fall, we could have already digested it a little bit at the backbone level, and then we had that as required reading. And we just have talked about it a lot. It's part of our, whenever we do a slideshow or a presentation, that one slide I had, we always use. So for us, it's a framework. That's all it is. I think a lot of people get a little bit like, ooh, collective impact. Like if we just do that, everything is going to be great. And really, as you know, Jennifer, it's a framework. It's an organizing principles around which you can structure an initiative. And the core components that go into collective impact are just really helpful to help make sense and hold everything together in a way that is just creates greater impact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's an important point to always emphasize. Collective impact is, yeah, exactly. You have a framework to be adapted and implemented locally, not a formula or a cookie cutter approach, for sure. You've mentioned a few times that real shared ownership of working group co-chairs, and a couple of folks have been asking, how much time would you estimate that those folks are spending in their role as a co-chair?
It will vary, because they meet quarterly, there tends to be a lot more around when the meeting's going to happen. The meetings tend to be 3 hours long, and then there's some development of the agenda, and then there's some follow-up. But we generally sort of think about in the sort of 5 to 10 hours a month range. So it's not a huge commitment. For those who are serving, like we have co-chairs of the working groups, and usually typically what they do is they divide up the workload. So one of the co-chairs makes sure that they're the person that goes to the steering committee meetings, which are 5 or 6 times a year, and really is active at that sort of higher leadership level. And then the other co-chair is doing more to sort of manage the working group meetings and keeping things going in the in-between meeting phase.
Got it. So other questions here are related to how you are funded and how you fund this kind of training. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, luckily the next slide addresses that. So
timely.
So we're really lucky that we have strong state support. So last fiscal year, and this is pretty similar to what we just ended our fiscal 18 year. So I don't have final numbers yet, but this is pretty similar. So the state supports us with about 31% of our budget, and we get 59% from foundations and a little bit of corporate sponsorship money, and then some registration fees and event fees, for instance, the other 5%. And of the foundation support, which is the largest, there are some funders that have made a real strong commitment to us to support the actual backbone functions of the network. So we've been really blessed with, and that's why we have this as sort of the desired 6th condition, is to have people, foundations that are really committed and understand the value of networks, understand the value of collective impact, and they have made a multi-year commitment to us to service us at a level that allows us to provide services to the full range of networks. And I think that part of that's one of the benefits of positioning a backbone organization in this way is, in essence, you're a very high impact grantee, because if you're providing services to 350 organizations that make all of them better, smarter, more impactful, then that $100,000 or $75,000 that one foundation's giving you is actually having a huge ripple effect across the system potentially. And then there are some funders that really just like funding projects. So we have a funder, for instance, that's funding our retail grocery store training that we provide to independently owned grocery store owners to learn how to better source and display and merchandise local food in their stores.
And so someone here has a chicken or the egg question. What came first, the foundation support or the state funding?
It actually came in together, interestingly enough, when the enabling legislation was being worked on by the legislature in 2009. The legislature was thinking that they were going to provide $100,000 for the planning effort, and I had a sense that that was probably not going to be enough, given the magnitude of the effort. And so I went to a bunch of the foundations that I've been talking to, and they committed $50,000. They would collectively come up with $50,000. And at one point, the legislature was trying to tinker around with whether or not they would give us the full 100,000, and the funders actually said, if you don't do 100, we're not doing 50. Now that has never happened before or since. But the point is that the foundations, because they have been so interested themselves in food system development work, they really think it's important that the state put in some money, and it helps the state to keep money in the program because of how much foundation money it then leverages.
Interesting. So some folks are wondering if you have like specific goals related to leadership development, and if so, how are you measuring progress related to the leadership development and capacity building?
We don't actually have goals related to capacity building. I mean, at this point, I think it was really important for us to do those trainings early on because it helped us to strengthen the type of culture that we were trying to create within Farm to Plate. So things like leaving your organizational ego at the door, for instance, and really sharing information, being willing to really give towards a more collective approach. It was really important in the early years for us to provide these trainings to have more people understand the approach we were trying to set forth. And once we got sort of a critical mass of people and the culture got understood enough and adopted enough, it just has been a more organic process, I think, since then.
Got it. So if you look, I'm curious if you look forward to this coming year, do you have trainings or leadership development type activities on the docket?
We don't actually.
All right. It is interesting though to think about the way that it has sort of embedded the culture, as you said, and made its way back into not only the collaborative, but also the home organizations where people are doing their work.
If you go to the next slide, we can just stay on that for a little while because this is something that we got from Curtis Ogden at the Institute for Interaction Institute for Social Change. Around connectivity, alignment, and action, and I added the years on there as a marker to just give people a sense of how long this work can take, especially and the value and the sort of the intentionality of developing a network as your mutually reinforcing activities aspect of collective impact. And even though connectivity, like we focused almost exclusively on connectivity in that first year, we did a lot of training in Network 101. We did a lot of training in network leadership and just what is this network approach? How do you be that way? And we continued that into year 2 as well. But that connectivity is really the foundation that's just always has to get built. And that's why I said I think one of the things that we've done really well and accomplished is the relationship building, because that's really the foundation of everything else. And then once you start getting everybody to really trust one another and build these relationships, better understand what each other's organizations and businesses are doing, or what is the appropriate role of government agencies within a particular system, then you can start to see where better alignment can happen, and you start breaking down the silos, and you start getting people collaborating more. But again, you're constantly building trust in that process. And then, and really only then, do you really get to the point of more impactful action, because in part through the connectivity and alignment process, that's where these different ideas, new ideas are bubbling up. This is where emergence happens, and you start to get a sense of where these obstacles, you're actually able to see obstacles with a new set of eyes in many ways, which then provides a different ideas for how to tackle that obstacle. And so, right now we're really in action mode with our network. We're scheduled to end by the end of 2020. And so much work has went into the early years to the connectivity and alignment, and that's really enabling some very substantive projects that are happening right now, where multiple organizations are working together collaboratively. They're going in on funding proposals together to really bring about some pretty significant marketplace changes. And at the same time, we're also starting to have a conversation about, should there be a Farm to Plate 2.0? Because after you get to the end of a 10-year initiative, what do you do? Do you just let everything fall apart and dissolve, or do you remake the structure? Do you do a new plan? Do you just update a plan? Do you what comes after 2020? So we're right now in the beginning phases of really exploring that with our network partners.
Nice. So you spend a lot of time at building connectivity, and then I know what a lot of initiatives experience is turnover happens, and staff turnover and leadership turnover. Can you talk a little bit about how you have worked through that kind of turnover across the network?
Yeah, and actually the interesting thing is, because we have elections for all of the working group and task force and cross-cutting team chairs, we've kind of baked in leadership change from the get-go and baked it into the process, because we set it up that, for instance, chairs can't serve more than 3 years, because we really want to have new people, new energy, new ideas coming in, and actually new people practicing being in a leadership role. Many of the people that are in leadership roles within the network might someday become executive directors of organizations, or they are assistants of something that become then directors of something. So, there is a larger goal here that's just sort of embedded, or it's kind of a parallel effort, I guess you would say, to just strengthen the overall capacity for leadership in the state as a whole, regardless of whether it's just food systems, for whatever it is. We're focusing on food systems, but I think it has a spillover effect to other parts of the economy.
And do you have onboarding processes or ways that new people tend to be brought up to speed and engaged?
Yeah, for new chairs, we have a pretty intensive onboarding process. It's a several-hour orientation with our staff. We have a 3-ring binder that has all of the policies and procedures and practices that we've developed within Farm to Plate. We've been really good at codifying things, and so we walk them through all of the, their job description, the contract, how to start working with them to build a work plan. We walk them through the administrative supports that we can provide them with, and then what the expectations are of what they need to be doing. And then, I think you kind of do it as you go along. We always have one of our backbone staff is always at one of the meetings, helping with note taking and such, so that, if they get into trouble, or if they're saying something that's not quite right, from a content perspective or something, we can interject and help support them as they're learning to take their seat in their new role, for instance. We're also able to be there to help with connecting dots, because we're going to all these meetings. So sometimes the chairs, they just haven't quite learned yet that there's some other working group that's doing something kind of similar, not exactly, but there's opportunities for connectivity, and they're They just don't know that yet. So, we're bringing them along as we go. But, having somebody in the seat for 2 to 3 years is really helpful. But then it's also really helpful for there to be change, because one, you don't burn people out, and secondly, you give somebody else a chance, and thirdly, it brings in fresh leadership that might take the working group in a slightly refined direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the term, remind me, the terms are 2 or 3 years.
We have a maximum of 3 years, but no, actually we changed that. We actually changed that to a maximum of 4 years. Now I think we're doing 2-year terms. We started off as 3 one-year terms. Again, it was also an opportunity in case we got a really bad chair elected, because people didn't know each other as well in the early years. So if somebody was just a terrible facilitator and just, the group was just floundering, we didn't have to wait for 3 years to have a change in leadership. We could move things along a little bit more quickly. But in the later years of it, doing that every year got to be a bit tedious, because people were basically, if they got to the point now where they get elected, they're usually well known because they've been in the group for a long time and they're trusted, and so they can serve as long as they wish, but not more than 4 years now. We started with 3-year terms.
And so can people sit on the working group as a member for as long as they wish?
Yes. Yeah, the key is here, this is a network of organizations. So the only people that are excluded from being in our network are individuals that don't have any connection to any organization. And that's part of the mutual accountability framework of our overall governance structure, is to say, you need to be accountable to somebody. You can be a consultant and have a firm, but you're representing your business then, right?
Right.
Or if you're a program director and you mess up, like your executive director is going to hear about it, because there's a mutual accountability that's built in from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And a clarifying question about the stipend, does that go to the organization? I think you said it goes to the organization, not to the individual.
It goes to the organization. If the chair happens to be a consultant or is a private sector business owner for something like that, there are times when it will go to the individual, but it goes to the organization.
Great. All right. So a couple of questions have come in about your organization's role as the backbone. So a little bit more about, did your organization get appointed into that role? How did you become the backbone? And then what the team that's playing the backbone looks like. We've talked a lot about the steering committee and the working groups, but say just a little bit more about how the backbone fits in.
Sure. So because the Sustainable Jobs Fund was tasked by the legislature to do the planning process, like building the common agenda, we built a lot of trust and a lot of credibility through that process, so that by the time we released the plan and we're looking at developing a network, people were just still looking to us to play that role. Then when Collective Impact came out and we saw the condition created around what is a backbone, this notion of a backbone, then we were like, oh, okay, that's what we are. So in part, you could say that we were legislatively enabled to serve in the backbone role, although when the legislation passed, that terminology had not yet become part of our vernacular. But as a backbone, we do things like we manage all of the shared metrics. So we collect all of the data and do the data visualizations and maintain that on our website to show population level indicator changes and performance measure changes. We do the continuous communication. So we have a monthly e-news. We maintain the website, which is really a platform for the network. Each group has their own page, and if you're a member of the group, then you have a login that allows you into otherwise unseen features like a listserv and document sharing and stuff like that the general public can't see, but if you're a network member organization, you can see. And that website was built specifically to be a platform for the network, not a general public-facing website. about all things food, for instance. We do a lot of the fundraising for the network. I mean, we basically fund the network activities, meaning covering the backbone functions plus stipends, which is about $90,000 a year in stipend money that we're putting out, that's running through us. We organize the gathering with the steering committee every year, but we do really the heavy lifting on designing and implementing the annual gathering. We are basically the holders and keepers of the common agenda. You know, we keep that really at the forefront. We have to provide an annual report to the Vermont legislature every year, so we're preparing that annual report and presenting it to the House and Senate Ag committees in our state, for instance. So those are some of the core functions. And then we also obviously support all of the working groups and task forces and cross-cutting teams. So I have 2 full-time staff who basically have divvied up the groups in the network, and they attend those meetings that they're connected to, that they provide support to. They work with the chairs in helping them to develop their agendas. They make sure the notes get taken. They provide whatever support that those chairs are going to need to basically be in a leadership role. So we're really, as a backbone, we're in a very much a service role. Like, we really think about being in service to the network and being in service to the common agenda. But we also need to be the entity within the network that's keeping an eye on 6, 9, 12 months down the line, because the steering committee can do that a little bit, but we're in it on a day-to-day basis, where steering committee members aren't. And so we're often the ones that are then thinking about, oh, you know, how do we set up the leadership retreat in the spring so that we can help them, the chairs, to see that there's opportunities for connectivity. And because they weren't seeing that, but we were seeing it. So how do we lay the ground and help introduce things to people so that they can come to it then and realize, like, oh, this is something we can be doing here. So we do a lot of that. So we're basically 3.5 staff. I have a coordinator person that helps with a lot of the doodle polls. She's sort of a doodle poll expert at this point, managing 23 different groups that meet throughout the year, between 2 and 4 times a year. So that's a lot to manage. And, you know, putting out the monthly newsletter and those kinds of things. And a little bit of my time. I used to put about 50% of my time towards this, but my time now is probably 10, 15% at max, as a for instance. And then part of a communications position here at our organization also supports the work of Farm to Plate.
Great. So what are some of the challenges that you have faced in either building the leadership capacity and shared accountability, or for others on the line, related to the collective impact work more broadly?
Sort of really just 2 things. And they're really about primarily around embedded in our culture, of the larger culture of how, for instance, nonprofits have to position themselves with funders in order to get more funding, like to say, well, we did these things. And inherently, when you take a network or a collective impact approach, the we is much bigger than any one organization inherently. And so learning how to share credit, learning how to help funders and policymakers in the private sector understand, or the government sector really understand, what true collaboration looks like, and how do you share credit with one another for a job well done, for instance, or taking on a new initiative and solving some big problem. In a way that's not about one single organization that's doing it. Because inherent in systems change work is, if no one organization can create systems level change. So therefore, no one organization can take credit for that work. So learning how to share credit, how to cross promote each other's organizations, that's a big learning for a lot of people that are very oriented towards self-promotion. And the second one, which is related, is connected to when you're part of a network, you're giving and you're getting, which ultimately means that you're not volunteering for this. Meaning, we had a lot of people early in the number of the first few years who would say, "Oh, well, I'm putting my volunteer time into being on this working group," and I would say, "No, you're not volunteering. This is your work." Like, you shouldn't be part of network work if you don't actually see that this work is really truly your work, because it should be something connected to your organization's or your business or your government agency's mission to be part of this work. So therefore, it's actually truly your work too. So it's our work and it's your work together. And so getting people over this notion of like, oh, if I'm going to this meeting, I'm volunteering my time. It's like, well, no. I mean, I guess unless you're not actually getting paid to be there, but in many cases, because you're there representing an organization, unless it's a totally volunteer organization, you are truly being paid to be there. So it is your work. And getting people to really understand that conceptually took some time.
Yeah, I hear that quite commonly across practitioners trying to navigate that. This will be the last question, and it's just a follow-up to what you were just saying. I think that idea of sharing credit across organizations is one that many initiatives face, that culture challenge. Do you have any tips or strategies that have shown to be effective in working through that?
Facebook, for sure. And also doing op-eds or other kinds of stories that get picked up by local papers, by actually calling out other organizations, giving credit to other organizations and not crediting your own organization. To be able to say, wow, NOFA Vermont has this amazing new CSA promotion program, and this is CSA month, and you should be signing up to be in a CSA. We don't talk about the Jobs Fund or about Farm to Plate in any of that. It's about NOFA, but we're the ones putting it out there as an organization. That then is promoting what they're doing. And so it just sort of happens then that they see that, and then they might give kudos back to Vermont Farm to Plate, like, hey, thanks Farm to Plate for pointing out that this is happening, that we're doing this. So there's ways to give credit, to give kudos in a way that also looks good on you, because you're putting it out there that somebody else is doing something really great. And Facebook is a great way to, just very easy way to share those kinds of kudos by calling out other organizations and tagging other organizations in your post of, calling attention to some job well done.
Yeah. Well, Ellen, there are a number of questions that came in that we weren't able to get to. So you clearly have piqued people's interest, and we really want to thank you for your time, and on behalf of the state of Vermont, all of the work that you do for the local economy and the food system. So thank you so much for that.
Yep.
Yes. Many people are saying you have been excellent. So thank you. I will just close with a few different words. We wanted to, in addition to thanking all of you for joining today, let you know of some other upcoming learning opportunities. As we mentioned, collective impact is not a model, but something that looks different in implementation everywhere. So we're excited to bring to you some other examples from across the country in the coming months. We have a virtual coffee on equity and collective impact in July with Pro-Mesa Boyle Heights. August 14th, we have one on using data with an initiative called Home for Good in Los Angeles. And on September 18th, we have a joint virtual coffee with two fantastic sites on sustaining the work and momentum over time, the Milwaukee Teen Pregnancy Initiative and the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. For those of you that are interested in a deeper dive, connecting with folks from across the country and some dedicated collective impact training, in October in Los Angeles, we'll be offering a collective impact workshop called Champions for Change. It is our longest standing offering and has sold out every time that we've done it. So if you are interested, we'd encourage you to register soon. The early bird deadline ends at the end of this month. So a couple more weeks to make that happen. So as I said, we are so grateful to you, Ellen. Thank you. And we look forward to connecting with many of you at another time. Take care.